Today I'm talking about Tooth and Nail, the second studio album by Dokken, released on September 14th, 1984 through Elektra Records. It is now celebrating 40 years. So in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the problems they had in recording this album, how the record label almost didn't want them to record a follow-up to their first album. Then I'll talk about some of the lineup changes and one of the members leaving the band to join another popular band at that time. I'll talk about the production and the internal struggles between Don Dokken and George Lynch and how they had to change producers midway through the recording process. And I'll also discuss some of the songs, such as one of their first big hits and a song that started a trend of metal bands releasing power ballads. So let's get into this now. Their debut album was called Breaking the Chains, and if you didn't know, there were two versions of this album. One version came out in 1981 and one version came out in 1983. The 1981 version was released in Europe on the French label called Elektra Records, and this version contains different mixes and titles from the later US edition. Then 2 years later, the album was remixed, partially re-recorded and released in 1983 through Elektra Records, and although it reached 136 on the Billboard 200, it was considered a flop by the label. So because of that, Elektra almost dropped the band, but Dokken convinced Elektra that they could make a better album, and they were successful because they released Tooth and Nail, which some fans believe is their best album. This album didn't come to fruition easily. There were lots of problems. One of the problems was the bassist, Juan Crucier. He left Dokken and he joined the band Rat. And Rat would later release their debut album, Out of the Cellar. And another problem was George Lynch. He was kind of in and out. He quit and rejoined multiple times. But George Lynch and Don Dokken also didn't get along very well, and that caused a lot of internal problems. During the time he was out of the band, Dokken went looking for other guitarists. They auditioned Warren DeMartini, but he also joined the band Rat. In the meantime, George Lynch auditioned for Ozzy Osbourne's band to replace Randy Rhoads, but he didn't get that position, which is some interesting trivia and would make a good topic for a what-if scenario. But then George Lynch decided that Dokken was his best option, so he stayed with the band. Now, at that time, they were lacking a bass player, so the manager of Shrapnel Records, whose name is Mike Varney, suggested a member of his band, which is called Cinema, and his name is Jeff Pilson, and he joined the band after an audition in 1983. And as you know, Jeff Pilson remained with Dokken for a long time. So now it's time to start pre-production on the album. Don Dokken asked his friend Michael Wagner to produce the album. He also did some work on Breaking the Chains, but the problem was the rest of the band didn't want Michael Wagner. So Elektra Records found somebody to produce the album, and that is Tom Werman, who had a pretty impressive resume. He worked with many multi-platinum artists, and one of his biggest accomplishments was producing Motley Crue's Shout at the Devil. So they started recording the album in the spring of 1984. They also worked with the sound engineer Jeff Workman, but he was also somebody who was difficult to work with. But the biggest problem was something I mentioned before, and that was the clash of egos between George Lynch and Don Dokken. To make things worse, both musicians were abusing cocaine and alcohol. So Tom Werman tried to make a schedule so that George Lynch and Don Dokken could work at different times, one in the morning and the other at night. And this is basically how the band Dokken worked for as long as George Lynch was within the band. But then George Lynch and Tom Werman ended up getting into some creative differences over a guitar solo. So Tom Werman ended up quitting and just taking his family vacation, and that meant Don Dokken made a second request to hire Michael Wagner, but the band still didn't want him. So Elektra found somebody else. He was a British producer named Roy Thomas Baker, who also had an impressive resume working with bands such as Queen, Journey, and The Cars. So it wasn't an easy task, but they were able to wrap up recording and mixing by August of 1984. So as for the music, Dokken was considered to be one of those bands that got mixed in with the glam metal scene, even though back in 1984, that subgenre was still in its infancy. The only bands that were popular at that time would be Motley Crue, Def Leppard, Quiet Riot, and a few others. But the scene would get much more popular in the late 80s. But the truth is that their debut album had more of a heavy metal sound with an influence of the new wave of British heavy metal movement. But this album was a little bit more melodic, a little bit more accessible, maybe even more radio friendly. but still had some heavier stuff on this album, as well as there was some more melodic stuff. And I'll talk about that as I go through the tracks. So let's talk about the songs. There are 10 tracks, 5 tracks on each side of the album. The album is 38 minutes long, so let's talk more about it. The opening track is an intro track called Without Warning. It's only about a minute and a half. It starts off with some synth, and at first it sounds like some intro to a horror movie from the 80s, but then George Lynch gives a brief solo, and that goes to the first song, which is Tooth and Nail. Tooth and Nail is pretty heavy. It has a fast drum beat. Some people argue it can be considered speed metal, although it still has some melodic parts, but it is one of the faster and more aggressive songs. Dokken has more of an aggressive tone in his voice, and George Lynch really shreds when it comes time to play the solo, so the song really contrasts with some of the more melodic stuff that will come. The next track is Just Got Lucky, and this was one of the singles. This was a big contrast between the previous song because this one is much more melodic, much more radio friendly. There's a music video showing the band performing the song inside a house of mirrors. Pretty cool music video, very 80s looking. On this track, George Lynch plays a guitar solo, which is a lot more melodic than the one from the title track, but that's because I think this song was tailored to be a single. After this one is one of the album cuts called Heartless Heart. This one has lyrics about a toxic relationship, and I read one comment by someone saying she was probably a narcissist, and the lyrics seemed to describe someone like that, even though that was not really a word people used back then. But anyway, it's a straightforward glam metal with some big guitars, some backing vocals during the chorus. It's a little heavy, a little melodic, pretty good album cut. The last song on side A is called Don't Close Your Eyes, and I know the band Kix had a song in the same title, which was a power ballad later on in the 80s, but this song in particular is one of the heavier ones. The song opens with a solo by George Lynch that really rips. The song also has some very intense drumming, and the main guitar riff was pretty heavy. This was one of the songs that showed off the heavier side. Also, George Lynch lets loose with an incredible guitar solo. Jeff Pilson's bass guitar can also be heard very well on the track. And check out Don Dokken's scream at the end of the song. Side B opens with When Heaven Comes Down, and the song has everything. It's both melodic, it's heavy, the guitar work is awesome. One of the more slower moving tracks, but the guitar riffs are pretty heavy. This one also has an awesome solo by George Lynch, which shows off his virtuoso side, while still being very melodic, and I would say this is one of the best songs on the album. The next song is Into the Fire. This is interesting because it would be used later in Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3 Dream Warriors, along with another song that Dokken did for that movie called Dream Warriors. And the music video is kind of interesting as well because they filmed it, I believe it was in Hawaii, near an active volcano. And you can see this volcanic ash blowing around, so that was pretty cool. And the music video is very 80s looking and has these women dressed as cave women with the big 80s hair and makeup, and you can see lots of different things. There's like helicopters and stuff. So this was one of the more radio-friendly songs. After this is an album track called Bullets to Spare. This was another pretty good album track. It has some vocal harmonies and a big chorus. The song has some pretty cool guitar riffs as well. The song features a breakdown with some clean guitar playing. It goes into a melodic guitar solo by George Lynch. Thought it was a pretty good album track, and the lyrics mention having a loaded gun with bullets to spare, but he's not talking about a gun, if you know what I mean. Then there's the big power ballad, Alone Again. This had a music video, showed a live performance. It had people putting lighters in the air, back when people still did that. Probably one of the most popular songs. As I said before, it was released before it became trendy for metal bands to release power ballads, but as we saw in the late 80s and early 90s, almost all metal bands had power ballads as their ticket to getting a Billboard hit. The last track is called Turn on the Action. This was one of the heavier songs on the album. It was very fast-paced. It had some rapid-fire drums, some technical guitar playing by George Lynch. It was a pretty good song. I think it's one of the more underrated songs from the album. George Lynch really shreds on the guitar solo. The song closes with some of those typical guitar pyrotechnics, so it was pretty cool. So in conclusion, it's a really good album from 40 years ago because this band knows how to keep that balance between being heavy enough to keep the metal fans happy and melodic enough to be accessible by the typical person listening to the radio. I think this band did a very good job of keeping that balance, whereas there were other bands from the scene that went too much in a commercial direction. I'm thinking of bands like Def Leppard or Quiet Riot, but Dokken had some strong players in the band. They knew how to keep it heavy and heavy enough to appeal to a broader audience. So those are my thoughts on Tooth and Nail. Let me know in the comments what you think of this album. Now, if you want to hear about their 1987 album, Back for the Attack, check out this video right here. I did that when it celebrated an anniversary not too long ago. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Please give this video a like. Helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe if you're not already. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.